Hey there, everyone. Brett here with Logos Veritas, and tonight, yeah, well, I guess this morning it's almost 1:30 my time. So uh, this morning here, I'd just like to be able to take some time with you guys and take a look at some kings in the book of Second Chronicles, starting in chapter 26, and what do they have to share with us today? As we're getting into that. Just some things that I've been studying, I've been reading over, and I thought was really good. I want to be able to share with you guys. Um, Starting in on chapter 26, we read about a king named Uzziah. Now, Uzziah, just for a brief context, this is the same Uzziah that the prophet Isaiah refers to when he says that in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. So just to give you guys a rough window to be able to refer to when you're wondering maybe when was this guy king, something that you can look back to. King Uzziah, starting in chapter 26, he becomes king when he's 16. He reigns in Judah for a long time. Okay, long time. And he did, in verse 4, it says, what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of the Lord. And as long as he sought the Lord made him prosper. Now, if you guys are at all familiar with the Old Testament and with God's promises to Israel when it comes to if you obey what I say, then I'll bless you. And if you disobey what I say, then there's going to be curses that you open yourself up to. Surprising no one, God is faithful to what he said, that if you obey what I say, if you follow my commands, I will bless you. So we see as Uzziah, as he walks in the fear of the Lord, as he seeks the Lord makes him prosper. He goes through, Uzziah is taking all kinds of land. And this is out in Israel where there's a lot of desert area out there. He's not only able to take land, he's able to dig wells, and controlling water in a desert environment, very important. He overcomes Philistines and Ammonites, both people groups they'd been in conflict with Israel for a long time at this point, but he's being given victory over them by the Lord. Everything is going pretty well for King Uzziah, and that's when things started to not go so well for King Uzziah. We shift over here to verse 16. But when he was strong, he grew proud to his destruction. For he was unfaithful to the Lord and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar. There was strict protocol on who was able to minister. They had rotations. The Jewish people did for what priests would be ministering where and when. You didn't just waltz into where the altar of incense was, which in the temple where he would have been moving into here to offer this incense, he would have been moving into the holy place. You don't just stroll on in there and offer up incense, whether or not you're a priest or the king, or maybe you donated a lot of money to the temple. You didn't. It's not something that happened, right? So for him to do this, he's in the Old Testament. You have two guys by the names of Nadab and Abihu, who were sons of Aaron, who was the first high priest in the line of the of priests that come from Aaron. His sons, two of them, Nadab and Abihu, they went before the Lord and went to go offer, it says, strange fire before the Lord. They went to go offer incense to the Lord in a manner that the Lord did not direct that needed to be done. And because they came in and they didn't listen to what they were told, they ended up dying. Uzziah, in his pride, and we just get done in the section right before this, starting in verse 11 and going down through 15. You're being briefed on the massive army that he had. I mean, he's taken land, he's holding land, no one can stop him, and he's had decades of control in his kingdom here, and he decides, I'm going to go on and offer the sacrifice. So you have Azariah, the high priest, goes after him with 80 priests, and they block King Uzziah from being able to get in and offer incense. And they tell him, like, hey, you're trespassing. You need to get out of here. And it says that King Uzziah was angry. Yeah. He had the censer in his hand. He's ready to burn incense in verse 19. He becomes angry with the priest. And as he is angry with the priest, leprosy breaks out on his face. Again, very strict regulations, guidelines for who can minister in the temple. And one thing that the Old Testament is very clear about, you cannot have blemishes and be ministering in the temple. You got, it even specifies at one point, if you have like eczema, you got something where you're scratching and you break the skin and you have these scabs and everything. Yeah, you're done. That's not going to happen. Let alone having a flesh-eating disease open up on your face. And because of this, the priests looked at him, and they saw that he was leprous, and they rushed him out quickly. They more or less forced him out, and it says that he himself was running to get out. He's hurrying out because the Lord had struck him, and so he lives out the rest of his days as a leper, separated from Israel, from the house of the Lord, and he lives in seclusion. So his son Jotham, it says, he was 25 years old when he begins to reign. He reigned 16 years. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord in verse 2, according to all that his father had done, except he did not enter the temple of the Lord. So he didn't waltz in there and decide he was going to offer up some incense just because he could. He learned from dad, I don't do that. So, but even though he walks righteously, he's doing what's right in the eyes of the Lord, the people in the kingdom were still following the example of Uzziah. And that's one thing that his account here teaches us, that even if you feel like you're justified in doing something, if you know it's wrong, sin never affects. Sin, missing the mark, violating the law of God, it never just affects us. There's always consequences that ripple out to other people. And Uzziah's pride here is one example of that. The people, they followed corrupt practices. It says, even though Jotham, leading them, was following the Lord and he was setting that example. It says in verse 6, Jotham became mighty because he ordered his ways before the Lord his God. Another version says because he prepared his way before the Lord. So because he was attentive, he was deliberate, he knew what the Lord wanted and followed in that. He didn't just kind of, well, I guess, whatever happens. I'll follow the Lord if he so leads me in that way. No, here's what he wants. How can I fall into line with that? How can I submit to him? How can I see his will accomplished here? How can I be in step with where he wants us to go as a nation? And so he became mighty. The Lord, again, surprising no one, blessed Jotham because Jotham was obedient to what they were told to do in Deuteronomy 28. Skipping down to Ahaz, Jotham's son, he's 20 years old and he begins to reign. And he reigned 16 years. He did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, as his father, as his ancestor David had done. It doesn't even refer to him as a king of Judah. It refers to him as a king of Israel, because the kings in the line of Israel were typically very wicked, and they did not do what the Lord asked of them, what he directed them that they needed to do. They kind of went off and did their own thing. It says he even made metal images for the Baals, or the Baals, however you want to pronounce that. And he made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his sons as an offering, according to the abominations of the nations the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Now, probably, we're dealing with a figure of speech here. Not every green tree, but he did it so much that, oh, there he is again. This guy, he's offering up incense under every rock and tree. And he goes so far as to sacrifice his sons. We're looking at Baal, a fertility god, and Canaan, dealing with a lot of livestock, with rain, things of that nature. And he's doing the exact thing, one of the very things that ended up getting the Canaanites ejected from Israel in the first place. By the Israelites. It said that the Lord waited until their iniquity, until their sin, and doing things they knew was wrong had reached its fill, and the Israelites came in, drove the Canaanites out of the land. So he ends up getting in some trouble here. He attempts to negotiate and become allies with Assyria. That backfires. They're not helping him as he gets into fights with Syria, into fights with the other kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdoms, and he suffers a crushing defeat from Israel. Says that the Lord had turned him over to the king of Israel and allowed Judah to suffer a crushing defeat. He seeks help from the Assyrians when the Philistines were making raids and everything. They wouldn't help Judah, and even though Judah tried to, King Ahaz here, he tried to pay off Assyria. They took his money, and then they still didn't help him, and they just kept kind of trolling him, on from there. So he ends up saying down in verse 23, he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus that had defeated him, and said, because the gods of the kings of Syria helped them, I will help them, that they may help me. Kind of that whole, if you can't beat them, join them attitude. And you can just say that this is not the way that you would want to live. Just because something seems to lend help to someone or to withhold help from someone, doesn't make it worth your trust, right? And some people would say that, him offering sacrifices to these idols, they're just sticks and stones, that this is not something that would really have any effect. I'm one that would be of the opinion that he is offering sacrifices to demons, to forces that have set themselves up against God, and that he's already in a vulnerable place, being outside, being part of God's chosen people, and being outside of God's protection, right? It's one of those curses that God said, if you disobey me, you're going to open yourself up to curses. You're going to be out from under my my covering, my protection, my blessing. And he's instead of turning to God, he becomes even more unfaithful. And he ends up dying. His son Hezekiah, one of the most famous kings in Israel, it says that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and according to all that David, his ancestor, had done. And we're not going to get into all that he happened with him under his reign. He's pretty famous, though. Feel free to read about him. There's a few chapters here that talks about him, and when Sennacherib, one of the Assyrian leaders, they invade and set themselves up against Judah. But even he fails with making this handoff effectively, with thinking generationally, because his son Manasseh was arguably the most wicked king that Judah had. I mean, there seems to be a pattern here. You got a godly king, and then someone who is wicked as all get out. And then, well, no, we need to go back to the Lord. And then, I'm going to do things my own way. I remember the way Grandpa did it, and he never had any problems. Okay. That, if bringing us up to today, then, right? We've got, according to Barna Research Group, we've got Generation Z today. Anyone born in the year 2000 or after, Gen Z, the generation that is being raised up right now, is the most racially, religiously, and sexually diverse generation in American history. Only about 4% of those in Gen Z claim to have a biblical worldview. Those who claim to be atheists have doubled, and about 33% of those who are in Gen Z feel that gender is how someone feels on the inside, and it really doesn't have anything to do with their biological, like, how do you even describe it? What their gender is biologically at birth. That is not what determines gender. Now, somewhere between around grandparents' age to the generation here with Gen Z, it seems that there has been some kind of a disconnect where, like in track, one minister I was listening to named Christine Kane was saying that your team in track, you can be crushing your opponents, you can be running the race extremely well, but if you're in a relay, you've got this baton that you're carrying, and if you fail on one handoff, it doesn't matter how close to the end you are, it doesn't matter how fast you've been going, any records that you've set, for maybe fastest lap or something like that. If you fail on the handoff, your team loses, no matter how well you were running beforehand. And with America largely being a Christian, a nation that was Christian and influenced largely by Judeo-Christian beliefs, philosophy, lines of thought, up until recently anyway, Gen Z is the first generation that is being described as post-Christian, because so many, 96% of Gen Z does not hold to a biblical worldview. If you're talking about Adam and Eve and Daniel, they be more likely to think that you're talking about folks who live down the street than figures in the Bible, which blows me away. But we're living in a different world now than maybe our parents, our grandparents were, and I'm late 20s, so we're in a much different context than even it was when I was growing up. So it brings us to, are we thinking generationally then? We'll skip forward in the Bible to Matthew chapter 28, and starting in verse 16, we take a look here, we're at the Great Commission, where Jesus, he ends up giving his disciples a mandate for when he leaves what we need to be doing. And in Matthew chapter 28, if you guys are there with me, I got one more page to go. If any of you are curious, I am reading out of the ESV. It's the ESV Fire Bible. Hashtag not sponsored. That's what we're running with tonight, or this morning. Chapter 28, verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Jesus came to them and said, and starting here in verse 18, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's a pretty bold claim, but I mean, Jesus did just come back from the dead. He's made himself known to 500 people. I believe him. Verse 19, go therefore. So because of, I have all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, because of that, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. We have had an emphasis on going and going and going and going and going, and some teaching. Well, baptisms, yeah. If you're depending on what church tradition you're in, I know there's different views held on baptisms and what needs to happen with that. But discipling is not something that if you tune into podcasts like, say, Rainer on Leadership as a good one. I love listening to their stuff, and he often talks about discipleship as something that needs to be happening in a leadership context, especially at church. There are others. There's youth, the Youth Hacks podcast. I think that's what it's called. They're part of the DYM network, and there's also I should have had these written down. I don't know. I'll list them later. But there's numerous ones that I've been listening to, whose titles I can't remember. But they're all drawing attention to the fact that we've done a good job at spreading the message, at asking people to come to a point of decision, and we've had a real bad habit of when people make a decision, when they surrender to the Lord and they say, okay, I want your will for me. We clap them on the back. Hey, welcome to the family, and hope you survive. And don't do a good job consistently with follow-up. With now that this person is new, basically an infant in following the Lord and in Christianity, are we providing that? Like with an infant, are we providing consistent contact? Are we providing assistance where it's needed? Are we getting them plugged into some kind of a support network? It's a little different than having a physical newborn, but spiritually and with the whole realm of new things to learn, it can be real overwhelming and intimidating. And we've not done a good job of the discipling and discipling people who will make disciples. And that's shown in our culture by 4% of the new generation. They don't hold a biblical worldview. Most of them wouldn't know the name of Jesus, except for if it's a swear word that people use at school. So it has to drive us to think, to think generationally. Not only are we going to be able to, when we're called home, when we die, right? And we're called to give an account for everything that we've done. Not only are we going to want to hear, that the things that we've done, to see the things we've done last, where it talks about Jesus when he judges, that everything that's not of any value is going to be burned away, and only that which is worthwhile is going to remain, and they'll be purified, and all that stuff. But what did you do with the gospel that was shared with you? Did you share that to other people? Were you more kind of standoffish about it and maybe embarrassed to be identified as that person? With 96% of the generation that's being raised right now not believing, it's hard to say that, yeah, we're absolutely doing everything we could. So it should be something challenging that, yes, this is something that they seem to struggle with in the Old Testament as well. And much as we can sometimes, well, look at those guys in the Old Testament, they weren't underneath the cross. They didn't have all the teachings that we have now, because they just didn't know any better. But we've got both the covenants here. We've got a completed Old Testament, a New Testament. Most of the books that are in our Bible, these kings didn't even have, and they were still able to walk in obedience to what the Lord asked. And are we doing a better job? We're doing a worse job. Will the word that we have here testify against us on Judgment Day, or will it be something that the Lord will be able to look to and say, hey, here's what I left you with, and you did a good job in following through with what I directed you to do. So come and share in your master's happiness, right? If we're dealing with the parable that Jesus gave us. So just some things that were on the mind, and things I wanted to be able to share with you guys. I know it's going a little bit long. We're at almost 28 minutes. Thanks for tuning in today, and I will look forward to touching base with you guys again. First podcast, but first live stream here tonight. Thank you very much for joining me. If you thought this was something that got you thinking, maybe kind of challenged you about what can we be doing in order to be faithful to the gospel that we've been entrusted with, how can we engage culture more, feel free to go ahead and drop me a like. It helps the channel out. Feel free to also subscribe if you want. I know the subscriptions don't always work very well. You'll have to hit the bell for keeping posted on what we do, content that comes up later. But thanks very much for joining me today, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. Thanks.